I've been fascinated in Iowa with a group called Strong America Now, which was founded by Mike George. Mike George is one of the creators of a management system called Lean Six Sigma. And Lean Six Sigma, to some political writers, their eyes glaze over and it sounds strange. Well, it happens to be the kind of management system that IBM uses, the kind of management, the largest logistics supply system in the world. It's the kind of management system that Boeing uses, the largest manufacturing exporter in the United States. It's the kind of management system that Motorola actually pioneered. They recently brought 1,500 jobs back from China to Arizona using Lean Six Sigma. So they actually are more productive in Arizona with higher paid American workers than they were in China. And Michael George believes that if you apply the concepts of Lean Six Sigma to the federal government, you save $500 billion a year. Now, $500 billion a year over 10 years is $5 trillion. Over 3 times the goal of the supercommittee. You think the supercommittee is going to have enough time and energy to actually learn what this is? Do you think their staffs are going to learn what this is? No, they're going to be engaged in an ideological fight. Tax increase, no tax increase. That's what they're going to be doing. And yet here, sitting on the table, IBM and Dell and a group of high-tech companies at the Tech Council issued a report last year and said, if you just ran the federal government like a standard multinational high-tech company, there's $125 billion sitting on the table. We did a book at the Center for Health Transformation several years ago called Stop Paying the Crooks. We thought the phrase was sufficiently clear. Our estimate was that in Medicare and Medicaid, between $70 and $120 billion a year is stolen. With food stamps, there are comparable numbers as a percentage. With supplemental security income, a recent report was $10 billion a year. So if you had a supercommittee that got together, or if you just said to the regular authorizing subcommittees, bring in experts who know how to do this and find out how to change the federal government so it moves at the pace of modern crooks. And what you have today is a paper-based bureaucrat from 9 to 5 versus an iPad thief. Now, there's no hope of a paper-based bureaucrat keeping up with somebody using an iPad. And the thief, by the way, stays after 5. So we had a dentist, for example, in New York State who filed 992 procedures a day and got paid. IBM pays 0.03 of one. American Express pays 0.03 of 1% to crooks because they have very sophisticated systems. Have any of you ever been contacted because they want to make sure that you were actually using your own credit card? How many of you have ever been contacted about your credit cards? Just virtually real time, right? 0.03. New York State Medicaid is above 10% fraud. So as a taxpayer, you are 330 times, that's 33,000% more likely to pay a crook than you are as an American Express cardholder. Now, an intelligent Congress in a city that wanted to be intelligent would hold hearings, bring in the experts, figure out how to fundamentally change the government. First of all, to apply Lean Six Sigma, which is continuous improvement, the biggest single new idea in government and running the government since the civil service reform in the 1880s. Part of what you do is you end up having to fundamentally replace the current civil service laws. Because you can't have permanent tenure, impossible to fire. You can hold your job forever even if you don't do it, and have a Lean Six Sigma company. What really broke it, Calista, who's here with me today, she and I went and visited the Boeing plant in Charleston where they're making the 787 Dreamliner. It's an extraordinary example of the modern world. Think about this in terms of the federal government today. And then go and look at all these huge high-rise buildings sitting around here with people sitting in them, massaging paper. The 787 plant, they have 4 Boeing 747s that have been rebuilt to look like guppies. They're huge rear, and they fly in entire segments of the 787 Dreamliner. They're manufactured in Italy, Wichita, Kansas, Korea, and Japan. They stream into Charleston, where they are then assembled. They were walking us around. This is the first composite-based commercial airliner, and substantially lighter than aluminum, stronger than aluminum, a fascinating design, extraordinarily sophisticated, being built all across the planet, and being built so accurately that it fits together. And they were showing us what to me was the eye-opener. And I'd studied under Deming many, many years ago, who was the father of the quality movement, and for whom the Japanese award for management is named. The Deming Award's their most prestigious management award. But we were standing looking at a particular work site, and they said, this process currently takes 16 days. We want to get it down to 6 with the same number of workers. And I thought to myself, can you imagine going through the federal bureaucracy? For example, our legal visa application system is a disgrace. It is cumbersome, expensive, requires people to hire lawyers, takes an enormous length of time. It actually basically says, you know, if you want to be law-abiding, it's going to be really expensive and really time-consuming. For less money, you can hire a coyote and come across the border illegally. I mean, it's the exact opposite of good government. And can you imagine taking the Boeing model, sitting down and going through that entire visa application process, eliminating all the waste, all the red tape, all the unnecessary functionalities? Of course you can't. Because you can't imagine real change. So this is a city that says, well, we'd really like to do better, but we can't do any better, so we're going to have to do less of what we're currently doing, or we have to raise taxes. Since you don't want us to do less of what we're currently doing, we have to raise taxes because, after all, you can't expect us to change. So we're going to expect you to change in order to pay the taxes we're going to demand from you. But you can't expect your government to change. You can't get this kind of thinking with 12 people. The whole Congress, I mean, every subcommittee should be assigned learning Six Sigma in the first couple weeks of September, bringing in experts, holding public hearings, reviewing everything they supervise. You know, I just got a study from the Gulf of Mexico that if we simply went back to the pre-Obama permitting system, we would add 230,000 jobs in Louisiana and Texas. I mean, that's straightforward. Because, you know, we've been trying to build a pipeline from Canada to Houston to move oil and natural gas, much of which will be exported to China, all of it at a profit. And the U.S. government has spent 3 years stopping the project. And the Chinese are now talking about paying for the pipeline to go from central Canada to Vancouver. Just skip the United States totally because we're not worth dealing with. The Dodd-Frank bill has so much red tape and so much regulation it's going to kill most of the small independent banks in the U.S. One major international bank is now thinking about pulling all their operations out of the U.S. Because we're just too hard to deal with now. They don't make enough money to justify being hassled by bureaucrats. I mean, this stuff is going on every single day. Boeing is the largest exporter in the U.S., so the National Labor Relations Board attacks it. I mean, think about it, if you were trying to create jobs as opposed to going on bus tours. If you were serious about creating jobs, you'd have to be for real change. So my first challenge here for the Congress is slow down and think through how are you going to learn enough to fundamentally change the government, which doesn't mean a big sweeping bill. It may mean that between now and Thanksgiving what we need are 90 or 100 or 200 small bills. Each one of them getting something good done, and then you add up the savings from 90 or 100 or 200 bills that you actually could read and understand. And it turns out you could probably, you know, let's say that you only save half the amount that the Lean Six Sigma people think you could save. $2.5 trillion, substantially more than the super committee. Just think about the whole concept in Washington. You have a super committee. What does that imply? And why is it super, other than that they've aggregated power into 12 people who will spend the next 3 months fighting? Second, the number one challenge is job creation. Now, I personally believe you cannot create jobs with class warfare and bureaucratic socialism. I think the idea is bureaucratic socialism is the model that says you get to keep your company, you just can't run it. That the bureaucrats will tell you how to run it. And everywhere I go, every level of business, big and small, says the level of aggressive bureaucracy is now a major problem, maybe a bigger problem than taxes. And so if you really were serious about job creation, you'd repeal Dodd-Frank, you'd repeal Sarbanes-Oxley, you would dramatically replace the EPA with an environmental solutions agency, you would create a new 21st century Food and Drug Administration whose job was to literally, their assignment, using Lean Six Sigma as a way of designing it, would be to know about science in the lab and move it to the marketplace and the patient as rapidly as possible. Now that would have two effects. It would dramatically accelerate health solutions for Americans, lower the cost of health care, improve American lives, And in the largest market in the world, which is what health will be, it would make America the dominant provider of health services and information and create millions of new jobs that are very high value. But that's literally the opposite of the current FDA mind. So you're talking about not just changing the bureaucracy, you're talking about changing the culture, getting people to get up in the morning and say, how can I help get these things to the American people, not how can I stop them? If you go back, there's a terrific book on polio. And if you read it, you'll discover that Salk discovers his vaccine, gives it to his own family to make sure it's safe. The following year, 1,400,000 Americans are volunteers. And the year after, the whole country is vaccinated. Take the current FDA model and lay that over the 1950s. And you realize that Salk would never have had the money to go through the current process. We'd still have people in iron lungs and people dying of polio. But back then, they actually were able to weigh and to use common sense and to say, how many people a year die from polio? What's the risk of trying this out? And they moved with enormous speed. But then these were the people who fought World War II. They were used to the idea that you had to be fast. You had to get things done. We're used to the idea that you have to litigate and regulate. Why would you expect to get it done? We beat Japan in 44 months from Pearl Harbor to victory over Japan. 44 months. And so in 44 months, we mobilized, beat Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Japan. It recently took 23 years to add a fifth runway to the Atlanta airport. And so when you start thinking about Lean Six Sigma, part of what you think about is it's not just taking out waste. It's defining what you're trying to accomplish and maximizing the rate of getting it done. So it actually adds value. I mean, so if you were to say, what do I save by reforming the Food and Drug Administration? It isn't just internal taxpayer savings. What if you triple or quadruple the number of American jobs in the health field by making us the dominant exporter worldwide? How do you quantify the advantage to the United States as a country of a pro-progress FDA rather than an anti-progress FDA? Because it has all sorts of second and third order effects. This is what Reagan's emphasis on growth was all about. Not just what are you going to score in government, but what are you going to achieve for the whole society. Let me suggest a grand package, if you will, a grand agreement. I'm for more revenue. I'm against tax increases. I'm for more revenue by getting Americans back to work, which increases revenue dramatically. I'm for more revenue by identifying federal assets and using them. And I'm for more revenue by developing American energy. Let me take the second and third and combine them for a second. If we had as a goal producing all of our own energy, keeping $400 billion plus at home, the economic side effect of $400 billion that went to the United States, not to Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, the effect on the world market of that much additional energy lowering prices would be extraordinary. And from a national security standpoint, it would be a terrific thing for us if we could have Iran getting a lot less money. But from an American economic standpoint, it would be important. It also turns out, for example, if you're drilling offshore or if you're drilling on federal land, they pay royalties. So it's a major source of additional revenue. A bipartisan proposal by Senators Webb and Warner, actually partisan, this says the two Democrats, but it's a bipartisan concept, that would allow Virginia to develop offshore and would give 50% of the royalties to Virginia, 37.5% directly to the state government as revenue, and 12.5% to land conservation and to infrastructure. So you could literally finance the rebuilding of Norfolk in order to handle offshore development by paying for it with the offshore development. This is an old American idea that if you have more economic activity and you get more revenue. So I'm for more revenue through more economic activity, through more jobs, and I'm for more revenue through the development of American energy. Remember, in hydrocarbon, coal, gas, and oil, we have more total energy than any other country in the world. Much more than Saudi Arabia, much more than Russia. We just happen to be geologically very fortunate. We have an anti-American energy bureaucracy and an anti-American energy government. And these are important jobs. In Pennsylvania, where the Marcellus Shale has developed new technology led to the development of shale gas, on a scale nobody thought possible. 10 years ago, people would have told you we have 7 years' supply of natural gas. They were going to build liquefied natural gas facilities to bring gas into the United States from the Middle East. Today, they'll tell you that because of our technological developments, we can now use shale gas at 8,000 feet or below. We now probably have 120 years' supply of gas. And we're now talking about building liquid natural gas facilities to ship gas out of the country to China as an export. The exact opposite of where we were 10 years ago. This is why technology matters. This is why you have to think dynamically, not statically. This is why bureaucracies are always wrong, because their models are always static. Well, in Western Pennsylvania, this is a fact. This is not a theory. This would be a good place for the president to go visit. In Western Pennsylvania, you have 72,000 new jobs since the last quarter of 2009, and the average salary is $73,000. In North Dakota, where the Bakken Formation has turned out to be 25 times bigger than expected, that's 2,500% bigger, they now have 3% unemployment. I mean, you would think some people in this city would say, gee, 3% unemployment would be good. What's the secret? Well, it's partly energy and it's partly technology. I mean, North Dakota has a very balanced economy. They've worked very hard between agriculture, high tech, and energy. But they're 3%. They've actually had 7 tax cuts, not tax increases. It also turns out if you cut taxes, it works. When I was Speaker, we cut the capital gains tax, the largest capital gains tax in history. Within 4 years, we had 75% more revenue from capital gains than we had at the earlier higher rate, because the lower tax led to more people being active, led to more people investing. Everybody agrees in general, I think literally everybody agrees, the current American corporate tax rate actually reduces the amount of revenue we get. This is just the Laffer curve applied in a practical way. I always tell people if we went to a 12.5% corporate tax rate, we would actually get money out of General Electric. We get no money from General Electric today because at 35%, they hire 375 tax lawyers. The largest tax firm in the world is the General Electric Tax Department. And it pays them to hire the lawyers to avoid 35% taxes. At 12.5%, they'd fire half the lawyers and write a check to the government. And you'd actually see an increase in government revenue. I mean, nobody disputes this. It's just this city can't do it, because it all gets locked up in politics and ideology. In fact, we all know there's about $1 trillion of profit sitting offshore that will not come home at 35%. At 12.5%, probably 600 or 700 billion of it would come home. If you had a tax holiday, almost all of it would come home. It's a fundamental difference in how you think about doing this. So I am for more revenue. Part 1 is energy. Part 2 is putting people to work. Part 3 is assets. I'll just give you 2 sets of examples. Somebody should inventory everything owned by housing and urban development and ask why. And we should frankly probably privatize getting rid of most of it. And you'll find out that there, particularly now after foreclosures, there are huge volumes of property held by the federal government, many of which are deteriorating because the federal government's not a very good landlord. But the second, more obvious example, we, the American people, own 69% of Alaska. Alaska's twice the size of Texas. This means we currently own 1.5 Texases. Now, as Governor Perry will tell you, Texas is a huge state. So if we have 1.5 of them, what if we took half of a Texas and said, that's the national parks, that's the wilderness areas, etc.? That would leave you an area the size of Texas you could develop. Now, what would the value in minerals, oil, gas? People believe maybe the largest coal reserve in the United States is in Alaska. Some people propose that you could use the coal in Alaska to actually create gasification, to both have natural gas to sell and to then take the carbon recapture and use it to enhance recovery from the North Slope, which would then extend the life of the current pipeline. This all requires creativity. And you can't get creativity out of 12 people fighting a political fight. But imagine you said to the Interior Committee, in both House and Senate, why don't you review all American properties and decide which ones we could actually allow people to develop? We own, I think, something like 89% of Nevada. Now, some of it's in military reservations, some of it is scenic, but 89% of a state, surely 25% or 30% or 40% of it could actually be opened up for development. The Chinese have a major effort worldwide to get rare earths, which are very important in manufacturing and are very scarce. We have huge deposits in California, which are currently off limits. So I'm for more revenue from using American assets. I'm for more revenue from American energy. And I'm for more revenue from getting people back to work. If you did those three things, you would dwarf any conceivable tax increase. At the same time, I'm for fundamentally rethinking the current system. Let me talk lastly about the legislative process. I think they've been going at it exactly backwards. And I say this as somebody who, for 4 years as Speaker of the House, got a fair amount of things passed. When you centralize into grand bargains, you maximize the ideological conflict. One of the most important lessons I ever learned was to try to train people to say yes if rather than no because. And one of the proposals I have, which will actually be in my newsletter at Gingrich Productions tomorrow, is a proposal that the House Republicans take up the Webb-Warner bill and pass it. Don't amend it. I mean, they could do this the first week they come back. Send it to the Senate. Now, here you have a bill that provides for offshore development of oil and gas, offered by 2 Democratic senators, one of them a former governor, endorsed by Tim Kaine, former governor and former Democratic national chairman, endorsed by Governor McDonnell, who thinks it could be a model for the country. The House Republicans passed it the first week they came back and said, look, this is a jobs bill. This is an energy bill. This is a revenue bill, all in one. What does Harry Reid then do? Does he say that a bipartisan bill introduced by 2 of his Democratic members is unworthy of the Senate considering? Or does he say, all right, let's send it to the President? And there are enough Democratic senators who've spoken out in favor of offshore development that I think actually you could get a filibuster breaking 60 votes in the Senate. At that point, what does the President do? Does he come off his bus tour to say, let me veto a bill that will create jobs? I think if the House Republicans would focus on legislating, not negotiating, if they would take and they ought to start every morning by scanning what Democrats introduce. I mean, if Democrats introduce a good idea, pass it. Because it starts to create a new rhythm. I proposed at one point in the middle of this mess that we adopt a principle that the first 3 days of the week you only bring up bills people agree on. Just to force people into a habit of looking for stuff to agree on. Because the psychology of saying, yes, there's a way we can do that, is so dramatically different than no, we can't do that. Now, it also lets you sidestep the tax fight for a long, long time. And I'm with Reagan. The lesson I learned from Grand Deals is watching Reagan with TEFRA in 1982, which was the Democrats were going to cut $3 of spending for every dollar of tax increase. And as Reagan wrote in his diary and later his memoir, they got the tax increases, which were permanent, and then they got a spending increase. He never again agreed to that deal because he just realized it didn't work. In 1990, we had the same thing again. And you just saw the same thing happen the other week. I mean, these grand compromises don't work very well. But 1,000 small, smart things actually would get more done than trying to lump it into one grand thing. I'd feel much more comfortable if the Congress set the following goal. By the beginning of November, we will have passed so many reforms that we will save more than the goal of the debt commission. So instead of the super committee getting $1.5 trillion, if they did it right, again, taking all the different things I've given you today, new revenue from energy, new revenue from assets, new revenue from full employment, dramatic modernization of the system, dramatic improvement of capabilities to reduce spending. My guess is you could be in the $3 trillion range by Christmas. Scored over 10 years. But it's a very, very different model. And so I'm speaking out like this because as somebody both representing people around the country that I listen to who are very offended by the super committee and very threatened by it and distrust it deeply. And also somebody who's legislated a fair amount. I really believe this model would work dramatically better, and I really urge the members of the House and Senate to look seriously at a model of legislating now, don't worry about negotiating, find good things to do, build up a really big mound of good things, and you'll be very pleased by Thanksgiving at how much you've accomplished.